February 1945. Yalta. The three most powerful men in the world sat in gilded chairs in the Levadia Palace, cameras flashing, smiles fixed for posterity. Stalin wore his Generalissimo's uniform, Roosevelt looked exhausted, Churchill puffed his cigar. They were carving up the post-war world, drawing lines on maps, making promises about democracy and free elections. Berlin, they agreed, would be divided into occupation zones, all very civilized, all very cooperative. But Stalin's mind was already racing ahead, calculating angles the others couldn't see. He'd spent decades surviving by trusting no one, assuming everyone was trying to deceive him, and he wasn't about to change now. The Western Allies were still hundreds of kilometers from Berlin. His own forces were closer, much closer, having bled their way across Poland and into Germany itself. The question burning in his mind wasn't whether Berlin would fall, it was who would take it first. He'd studied the maps obsessively. The Americans and British were advancing from the west, their supply lines stretched, their armies tired from the Ardennes offensive. His own forces, the First Belarusian Front under Marshal Georgy Zhukov, and the First Ukrainian Front under Marshal Ivan Konev, sat poised on the Oder River, just 60 kilometers from Berlin. Simple mathematics suggested the Soviets would get there first. But Stalin had learned long ago that nothing in war was simple, and the Western Allies had surprised him before. The diplomatic niceties at Yalta masked a deeper competition. Stalin watched Eisenhower's forces, tracked their movements, analyzed their intentions. Were they really going to honor the occupation zone agreements? Or would they race for Berlin, seize the Nazi capital, and present the Soviets with a fait accompli? Roosevelt seemed sincere, but Roosevelt was dying. Anyone could see that. Churchill was another matter entirely. The British Prime Minister had always been suspicious of Soviet intentions, always pushing for a stronger Western position in Central Europe. Stalin assumed Churchill would push for Berlin if given half a chance. March arrived cold and wet. The Eastern Front had become a grinding advance through German territory, every town and city a fortress, every kilometer paid for in blood. The Red Army had lost millions getting this far. 20 million Soviet citizens dead, cities reduced to rubble, entire generations decimated. Stalin wasn't about to let the Americans and British waltz into Berlin and claim victory after the Soviets had done the dying. Berlin wasn't just a military objective. It was symbolic vindication, proof that the Soviet Union had defeated Nazi Germany, that the Great Patriotic War had been won by Soviet arms and Soviet sacrifice. He received intelligence reports daily. American forces here, British forces there, movements tracked, intentions analyzed. His paranoia wasn't entirely unfounded. Some Western commanders did want to race for Berlin. Patton was chomping at the bit. Churchill was drafting cables urging a push eastward. But the decision wasn't theirs to make. It belonged to Dwight Eisenhower, the supreme Allied commander, and Eisenhower was thinking strategically, not symbolically. March 28, 1945. A cable arrived in Moscow that changed everything. Stalin read it twice, then called for his translator to verify he'd understood correctly. The message was from Eisenhower himself, sent directly to Stalin, bypassing the usual diplomatic channels, bypassing even Churchill. It was unprecedented. It was also crystal clear. Eisenhower laid out his plans with remarkable candor. His main thrust, he wrote, would be toward Leipzig and Dresden, not Berlin. The German capital had lost its strategic importance. The real objective was to prevent the Nazis from establishing a redoubt in the Bavarian Alps, to link up with Soviet forces somewhere in central Germany, to cut the Reich in half. Berlin, Eisenhower suggested, was now primarily a political objective, and he was a military commander, not a politician. He would leave Berlin to the Soviets. Stalin stared at the cable for a long moment. His first instinct was suspicion. Was this a trick? Were the Americans trying to lull him into complacency while secretly preparing a dash for Berlin? He'd spent his entire political career assuming everyone was lying to him, and it had kept him alive through purges and plots and assassination attempts. Why would Eisenhower tell him the truth? But as he read the cable again, analyzed the reasoning, cross-referenced it with intelligence reports about American troop dispositions, a different possibility emerged. Maybe Eisenhower meant exactly what he said. Maybe the Americans really were going to let the Soviets take Berlin. The military logic made sense. Berlin was surrounded by water barriers, fortified neighborhoods, and a garrison of desperate defenders. Taking it would be costly, brutal, house-to-house fighting through a city that Hitler had turned into a fortress. Why would Eisenhower spend American lives on a symbolic victory when the war was already won? Stalin's expression didn't change as he set the cable down, but his mind was already moving, planning, calculating. If this was real, if the Americans truly weren't going to contest Berlin, then he had a narrow window of opportunity. But he couldn't simply accept Eisenhower's word. He needed to act as if the race was still on, needed to take Berlin as quickly as possible before anyone changed their minds. April 1st, 1945. Stalin summoned his two top marshals to the Kremlin. Georgy Zhukov and Ivan Konev arrived separately, neither knowing why they'd been called, neither aware the other was coming. Stalin enjoyed these games, pitting his subordinates against each other, keeping everyone slightly off balance. It was how he maintained control. They met in Stalin's office, maps spread across the large table, the spring evening darkening outside. Stalin was smoking his pipe, his face impassive. He gestured for them to sit, then slid a document across the table. It was Eisenhower's cable. "Read this," Stalin said. Both marshals read in silence. Zhukov finished first, his scarred face betraying nothing. Konev took longer, his eyes narrowing as he absorbed the implications. When they looked up, Stalin was watching them. "So who is going to take Berlin?" Stalin asked. "We or the Allies?" The question hung in the air. Both marshals understood immediately that this wasn't really a question. It was a test, a challenge, a command wrapped in interrogative form. Stalin already knew what answer he wanted. He wanted to know if they had the will and the capability to deliver it. "We will take Berlin," Zhukov said, his voice flat and certain. "The First Belarusian Front will take Berlin." Konev leaned forward. "The First Ukrainian Front is also in position to strike for Berlin. We can reach it from the south." Stalin's eyes moved between them, measuring, calculating. Here was the moment. Eisenhower had given him Berlin, whether intentionally or not. But the Western Allies were still advancing. Churchill was still pushing for a more aggressive strategy. The window might close at any moment. He needed Berlin taken fast, needed it secured before anyone changed their minds, needed the hammer and sickle flying over the Reichstag before the Americans reconsidered. "How long?" Stalin asked. "How long will it take?" Zhukov didn't hesitate. 2 weeks. Perhaps 12 to 15 days from the start of the operation. Konev nodded. "Similar. 2 weeks at most." Stalin stood, walked to the map on the wall. The Oder River marked the current front line. Berlin sat just beyond it, a red circle on the map, the heart of Nazi Germany. He traced the route with his finger, calculating distances, considering obstacles. The Germans would defend Berlin with everything they had left. It would be brutal, but it would also be final. "You will both prepare for an assault on Berlin," Stalin said, turning back to face them. "The operation will begin in 2 weeks. April 16th. Both marshals straightened. 2 weeks was incredibly tight. They'd need to move supplies, position artillery, brief commanders, coordinate air support. But neither argued. You didn't argue with Stalin. "The boundary between your fronts," Stalin continued, walking back to the table and picking up a red pencil, "will run here." He drew a line on the map, marking the division between Zhukov's First Belarusian Front to the north and Konev's First Ukrainian Front to the south. The line ran east to west, approaching Berlin, but then stopped. Deliberately, conspicuously, Stalin's red line ended 65 kilometers short of Berlin itself. Zhukov and Konev both stared at the map. The implication was obvious. Stalin had left Berlin in contested territory. He wasn't assigning the capture of the capital to either marshal. He was making them race for it. Whoever got there first would claim the glory. Whoever got there first would be the man who took Berlin. It was classic Stalin. He trusted no one completely, preferred to keep his subordinates competing, always maintained multiple options. If Zhukov's frontal assault stalled, Konev could swing north and take the city from the south. If Konev got bogged down, Zhukov would have a clear path, and the competition between them would drive both to move faster, fight harder, accept higher casualties. Stalin would get his victory, and the price would be paid by others. "I want Berlin taken before the Americans change their minds," Stalin said. "I want the red flag over the Reichstag before May Day. Can you do this?" "Yes," both marshals said simultaneously. Stalin nodded slowly. "Then do it. Dismissed." After they left, Stalin returned to the map. He stood there for a long time, smoking his pipe, studying the approaches to Berlin. The city was a fortress, defended by the remnants of the Wehrmacht, by SS fanatics, by Hitler youth with Panzerfausts, by old men and young boys pressed into service for a last desperate stand. The Soviets would pay in blood for every street, every building, every bridge. But they would take it. They had to take it. The cost didn't concern him particularly. The Red Army had already suffered catastrophic losses. What were a few thousand more lives, a few tens of thousands, measured against the symbolic importance of capturing Berlin? The Soviet people needed this victory. They needed to see their flag flying over the Nazi capital. They needed proof that their suffering had meaning, that the millions who died had died for something. But there was more to it than symbolism. Stalin was already thinking beyond the war, beyond Germany's defeat, to the post-war order. Whoever controlled Berlin would control Germany. Whoever controlled Germany would dominate Central Europe. The Americans and British were allies now, but Stalin had no illusions about the future. The capitalist powers had opposed the Bolshevik Revolution, had intervened in the Russian Civil War, had hoped Hitler and Stalin would destroy each other. The wartime alliance was temporary, born of necessity. When Germany fell, the real competition would begin. Taking Berlin first would give the Soviets a massive advantage in that competition. It would let them establish facts on the ground before the peace conferences began. It would let them install a friendly government in the heart of Germany, secure their western border, create a buffer zone against future threats. Yalta had promised free elections in Eastern Europe, but Stalin knew elections could be managed, results could be guaranteed, especially if Soviet troops were already in place. Eisenhower's cable had been a gift, whether the American general realized it or not. By choosing not to race for Berlin, by prioritizing military over political objectives, Eisenhower had handed Stalin exactly what he wanted. Churchill understood this, which is why the British Prime Minister was furious when he learned about Eisenhower's decision. But Churchill didn't command American forces, and Roosevelt was too ill to intervene effectively. The Americans would go to Leipzig and Dresden. The Soviets would take Berlin. The next 2 weeks were a frenzy of preparation. Zhukov assembled a massive force along the Oder, more than 1 million men, thousands of tanks and artillery pieces, entire air armies. Konev did the same to the south, matching Zhukov gun for gun, tank for tank. The competition Stalin had engineered was working exactly as intended. Both marshals were determined to be the one who took Berlin. Both were throwing everything they had into the assault. Stalin monitored the preparations daily, receiving reports, issuing orders, pushing for speed. He was 76 years old, his health declining, his paranoia, if anything, intensifying with age. But his mind was still sharp, still calculating, still focused on power and how to maintain it. Berlin was the key. Berlin was everything. April the 16th, 1945, 4:30 in the morning. The darkness along the Oder River erupted in fire. Thousands of Soviet artillery pieces opened fire simultaneously, the largest barrage in military history, shells screaming across the river, smashing into German positions, turning the night into day. Searchlights blazed, blinding the defenders, silhouetting the Soviet infantry as they charged forward. The assault on Berlin had begun. Zhukov attacked from the east, directly toward the city. His forces hit the Cielo Heights, a ridge of high ground defending the approaches to Berlin, and ran into fierce resistance. The Germans fought with the desperation of men who knew they were defending their capital, their homes, their families. The battle for the heights lasted 3 days, cost thousands of Soviet lives, but Zhukov kept pushing, kept throwing men and tanks forward, kept grinding through the German defenses. Konev attacked from the south, crossing the Neisse River, breaking through German lines, wheeling north toward Berlin. His advance was faster than Zhukov's, his casualties lighter. Stalin watched the reports coming in, saw Konev pulling ahead in the race, and did nothing to stop it. Let them compete. Let them both drive forward. Berlin was all that mattered. In his office in the Kremlin, Stalin studied the maps, moved pins representing Soviet units, calculated the distance remaining. The Americans were still advancing in the west, but slowly, methodically, not racing for anything. Eisenhower had kept his word. The path to Berlin was clear. April 21st, Soviet forces reached the outskirts of Berlin. The city was surrounded, cut off, doomed. Inside, Hitler raged in his bunker, ordering counterattacks by armies that no longer existed, moving phantom divisions on maps, refusing to accept reality. Outside, Soviet troops began fighting their way into the suburbs, block by block, building by building. The battle for Berlin was everything Stalin had expected. Brutal, costly, relentless. Soviet soldiers fought through streets filled with rubble, cleared buildings floor by floor, faced resistance from soldiers and civilians alike. The Germans had turned their capital into a fortress, and they defended it with fanatical determination. But the outcome was never in doubt. The Red Army kept coming, kept advancing, kept paying the price in blood. April 30th, Soviet troops reached the Reichstag, the symbolic heart of Nazi Germany. Fighting raged inside the building, room to room, stairwell to stairwell. That same day, in his bunker a few blocks away, Adolf Hitler put a pistol to his head and pulled the trigger. The 1,000-year Reich died with him. May 2nd, 1945. The garrison commander of Berlin surrendered. The red flag flew over the Reichstag. Soviet soldiers posed for photographs in the ruins, exhausted, victorious, having paid an enormous price for this moment. Berlin was theirs. The war in Europe was effectively over. Stalin received the news in his office. He'd been awake for most of the night, monitoring reports, waiting for confirmation. When it came, he allowed himself a small smile. Berlin. The Soviets had taken Berlin, not the Americans, not the British. The Red Army had captured the Nazi capital, had avenged the 20 million dead, had proven the superiority of Soviet arms. He thought back to that moment in late March, when Eisenhower's cable had arrived. The moment when he'd realized Berlin would be theirs. The moment when the race had been won before it even started. The Americans had made a military decision. Stalin had understood it as a political gift, and he'd seized it with both hands. The cost had been staggering. Estimates would later suggest that the battle for Berlin cost the Red Army somewhere between 80,000 and 100,000 dead, with hundreds of thousands more wounded. The city itself was devastated, block after block reduced to rubble, tens of thousands of German civilians dead. But Stalin had his victory. He had his symbol. He had the Soviet flag flying over the Reichstag. In the years that followed, Berlin would become the focal point of the Cold War, divided between East and West, a city split by ideology and concrete walls. Stalin would use Soviet control of Eastern Berlin to establish a communist government in East Germany, to create the buffer zone he'd always wanted, to project Soviet power deep into Central Europe. The decision to let the Soviets take Berlin, made by Eisenhower for military reasons, would have political consequences that lasted for decades. But in that moment, in early May 1945, Stalin simply savored the victory. He'd outmaneuvered the Western Allies, had secured Berlin before they could change their minds, had delivered the symbolic triumph the Soviet people needed. The Great Patriotic War was won. The Red Army had marched from Stalingrad to Berlin, had survived the worst the Wehrmacht could inflict, had emerged victorious from the most brutal conflict in human history. Stalin called in his marshals, Zhukov and Konev, both of whom had fought their way into Berlin, both of whom claimed credit for the victory. He let them argue for a moment, then raised his hand for silence. "Berlin is ours," he said simply. "The war is won." It was the closest thing to praise either marshal would receive. Stalin didn't believe in excessive celebration, didn't trust triumph, always worried about what came next. But for one brief moment, he allowed himself to acknowledge what they'd accomplished. The Soviet Union had defeated Nazi Germany. The red flag flew over Berlin. And Stalin, the paranoid Georgian who'd clawed his way to absolute power, who'd survived purges and plots and a war that nearly destroyed his country, had secured his place in history. The question he'd asked his marshals in April had been answered. Who would take Berlin, the Soviets or the Allies? The Soviets, always the Soviets. Stalin had made certain of that, and when he'd realized, reading Eisenhower's cable on that March evening, that Berlin would be theirs first, he'd moved with characteristic ruthlessness to make it happen. The city lay in ruins. Millions were dead. Europe was devastated. But Berlin belonged to the Soviet Union, and that made all the difference. Stalin had understood, perhaps better than anyone, that wars aren't just won on battlefields. They're won in the symbols that follow, in the flags that fly over conquered capitals, in the stories nations tell themselves about their victories. Berlin was that symbol, and it was his.